The sun crawled over the pale Iowa fields like it was dragging something heavy behind it. James Walker stood on the porch with a chipped mug in his hand, watching the light bleed across land that had stopped cooperating years ago. The soil that once turned black and rich beneath spring rains now cracked like old leather. 6 weeks without water, the cornstalks in the distance looked skeletal, rattling in the wind like bones. His John Deere sat motionless beside the barn, paint faded to a ghost of green, one tire flat, the engine seized up 2 summers back when he couldn't afford the parts. 4 Holstein cows wandered near the fence line, ribs showing through their hides, chewing on grass that barely qualified as food. The farm wasn't dying. It was already dead. He just hadn't buried it yet. 5 years. 5 years since Margaret went into the ground at St. Mary's Cemetery with half the county standing in the rain because everyone loved her. She'd grown up in Chicago apartments, but chose this place, chose dirt roads and endless sky, chose him. The accident in 1990 stole their chance at children. Some drunk driver ran a red light and left her with scars inside that doctors couldn't fix. So they poured everything into the land instead. Every acre was a prayer. Every harvest was a child they'd never have. Now the land was taking it all back. James set the mug down on the porch rail and walked to the mailbox. The red flag hung limp. Inside, 3 envelopes. 2 bills he couldn't pay. One from First National Bank with a return address that made his stomach drop. He tore it open standing there in the dirt. Final notice. Foreclosure proceedings initiated. Outstanding balance $87,000. 90 days to satisfy debt or surrender property. The paper trembled in his hands, not from fear, from rage at how small the number looked for everything it would take. 90 days. 90 days to save 40 years. He walked back inside and dropped the letter on the kitchen table next to a framed photo from 1986. Margaret in her wedding dress hair, dark and wild, laughing at something he'd said. Her face was so clear in the picture he could almost hear her voice. "Keep the farm, James. Promise me." Her last words whispered through morphine haze and lung cancer that ate her from the inside. He'd promised like a fool who thought promises could stop the world from taking everything. The phone on the wall rang. He ignored it. Probably the bank. Probably someone else he owed money he didn't have. The ringing stopped. The house settled back into silence so complete it felt like being underwater. James poured himself another cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago and sat at the table. The Midwest Chronicle lay folded where he'd left it 3 days prior, unread, because what was the point of news when your own life was falling apart? But his eyes caught on a boxed ad at the bottom of the classified section. Estate auction, Ashford property. Machinery tools, antiques. Property of Victor Ashford. Deceased, Saturday, April 20th. 10 a.m. 1847. County Road, 18 Des Moines. The name stirred something. Victor Ashford. James had heard it before, maybe from his father, maybe from some old-timer at the feed store. Ashford Ironworks. Shut down before World War II ended. Rich as a king, they said, until he wasn't. Miscellaneous mechanical items, heavy engines, agricultural equipment. James stared at the words until they blurred. He needed a plow, needed something, anything to convince himself There was still a point to working ground that didn't want to grow anything. The auction was tomorrow. He had maybe $40 in his wallet and a credit card that was probably maxed out. Margaret's voice came to him across 5 years of silence. Best things are what others overlook. She'd said that once when they found a rusted bed frame at a yard sale and she saw what it could become. Sanded it down, painted it white, and they slept in it for 20 years. She had a gift for seeing past the surface. He used to have that gift too, before grief made everything look the same shade of gray. James folded the paper and stood. Tomorrow he'd drive into Des Moines. Maybe there'd be something cheap. Maybe there'd be a reason to keep going. Maybe was all he had left. The alarm clock dragged him out of sleep at 5 a.m. Saturday morning. James, dressed in Carhartt work pants and a flannel shirt that smelled like diesel, and old sweat pulled on his boots, and climbed into his 2008 Silverado that started on the third try. The drive took 40 minutes through flat country where the sunrise painted everything gold and made it look like the land might still be worth something. The Ashford estate sat at the end of a gravel road lined with semi-trucks and trailers. Hundreds of people already milling around by the time James arrived at 9:30. The air smelled like diesel fuel and rust, thick enough to taste. Men in work clothes clustered around equipment, poking at gears, kicking tires, calculating value in their heads. An auctioneer's voice crackled over a PA system, warming up the crowd. James walked slowly through the yard. Combine parts stacked like monuments to obsolescence. Threshing drums corroded beyond repair. Steel wheels sunk into mud. Everything looked like it had been sitting there since Eisenhower was president. He passed a group of younger men, collector types with checkbooks and smartphones, laughing about something. Then he saw it. At the far end of the property, half buried in weeds and shadow, a massive steel beast sat alone, like it had tried to crawl back into the earth and given up halfway. The thing was enormous, 8 feet tall, 4 tons at least. Great iron wheels sunk deep into soil that had grown around them over decades. A smokestack rose from the boiler like a watchtower. Riveted panels, blackened by rust, formed a skin that looked almost alive in the morning light. James moved closer. The nameplate was barely visible beneath grime and corrosion, but he could make out the letters Titan 1918, Ashford Industries. A steam tractor, one of the first ever built probably. The kind that broke virgin prairie and hauled entire barns on sledges before gasoline engines made them obsolete. This one looked like it hadn't moved since the Hoover administration. Vines had grown through the wheel spokes. Moss covered the northern side of the boiler. It was magnificent in the way dead things sometimes are when they refuse to completely disappear. One of the auction workers stood nearby, young guy with a clipboard, smirking when he saw James staring. That thing hasn't moved since the Hoover administration. Goodwin brought it over from Illinois. Said it was one of the first steam tractors ever built. Museum piece. Now, if you can find a museum that wants a ton of rust. James didn't answer. He walked around the machine slowly, running his hand along the flank of the boiler. The metal was cool, despite the sun surface, rough like old bark. Rust flaked off under his palm, but beneath the decay, he could feel the solidity, the weight, the dignity of something that had done real work when work still meant something. Margaret would have loved this. The thought came unbidden and sharp. She'd always been drawn to things other people threw away. Saw the bones underneath, saw what could be instead of what was. James closed his eyes and let himself imagine her voice. "Get it, James, bring it home, make it beautiful again." The PA system squawked to life. The auction was starting. James made his way to the front of the crowd, standing at the edge where he could still see. Smaller items went fast. Engines, tools, even a cracked oil pump fetched $20. The auctioneer worked through the inventory with practiced efficiency, voice rising and falling in that rhythm that turned selling into a kind of music. Then they reached the Titan, antique steam tractor, one of a kind, no guarantee of function. "Who will start me at $50? Silence. Then laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone near James muttered about scrap value. Someone else made a joke about lawn ornaments for rich people. The auctioneer tried again. 20, 10 more. Laughter. James felt something twist inside his chest. Anger, maybe, or recognition. Here was this machine that had probably plowed 1,000 acres, hauled loads that would break modern equipment, survived a century of weather and neglect, and these people were laughing at it because it didn't shine. His hand went up before his brain caught up. $1. The laughter got louder. Men were actually slapping their knees. The auctioneer grinned. "Well, folks, looks like we've got ourselves a historian here. $1. Any other bids?" "No, sold to the gentleman in the cap for $1. The gavel came down. James walked to the payment tent in a daze, pulled 2 singles from his wallet, one for the machine, one for the processing fee, and signed paperwork that transferred ownership of 4 tons of steel to a man who could barely afford coffee. Loading the Titan took the rest of the afternoon. A crane operator charged him $200 James didn't have, but put on the maxed-out credit card anyway. Chains groaned. The machine rose from its grave of weeds with a screech that turned heads across the yard. People stopped to watch. Some took pictures. James heard the whispers, "That's the guy who bought it for $1. Crazy old farmer. Probably thinks he can fix it." The Titan settled onto his flatbed trailer with an impact that made the whole truck shudder. James climbed into the cab, hands shaking slightly on the wheel, and pulled out onto the county road. In the rearview mirror, he could see the massive silhouette following him like a shadow from another century. The drive home took an hour. Sunset turned the sky red and orange, and for a moment, just a brief, impossible moment, the light hit the Titan's steel skin, and it looked almost new, almost alive, like the rust was just a disguise, and underneath was something waiting to wake up. By the time James reached his farm, darkness had settled in. He unhooked the trailer beside the barn and stood there in the quiet, looking at what he'd done. 4 tons of history sitting in his yard, bought for $1 he couldn't afford. Margaret would have said he was crazy, but she would have understood. Worth $1, maybe more if it stands proud enough. The words came out in a whisper. Then he turned and walked back to the house, too tired to think about tomorrow. 3 days passed before James touched the Titan again. 3 days of staring at it from his kitchen window, drinking coffee, wondering what the hell he'd been thinking. But on the 4th morning, he woke with something that almost felt like purpose. He couldn't save the farm, couldn't bring Margaret back, couldn't fix any of the things that actually mattered. But maybe he could clean up this machine, make it presentable, give it the dignity it deserved. He started with steel wool and elbow grease, scraping off loose rust, brushing away decades of grime. The work was meditative, repetitive. His mind could drift while his hands stayed busy. Beneath the corrosion he found traces of the original paint, navy blue, faded, but still visible in protected spots. The nameplate cleaned up better than expected. Titan. 1918 emerged letter by letter until it gleamed dully in the spring sunlight. On the third day of cleaning, James decided to open the firebox. The door hadn't budged in God knew how long. He sprayed WD-40 into the hinges and waited, then got a pipe wrench and applied steady pressure. Something inside gave way with a crack that echoed across the empty yard. The door swung open, and a cloud of soot puffed out, making him cough. Inside was exactly what he expected, thick black ash coating every surface, the smell of old coal and rust. James knocked on the inner wall with his knuckles testing the thickness and froze. The sound was wrong, not the hollow clang of an empty firebox. Something duller, muffled. He knocked again, moving along the curve of the interior wall, listening. Most of it rang clear, but one section, maybe 12 inches across, sounded like he was knocking on solid metal. James stepped back frowning. He examined the interior more carefully. The ash inside was undisturbed except where his hand had touched. But along one seam he could see where the metal looked different, smoother. The welds were finer, more precise, like they'd been done by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had something to hide. He grabbed a hammer and tapped along the seam. Definitely solid behind there. Not ash, not empty space, metal that didn't belong. His heart started beating faster. James wasn't a stupid man. He'd lived on this farm his whole life, fixed every piece of equipment he'd ever owned, knew metal the way other men knew scripture. Someone had built a false wall inside this firebox. Someone had hidden something inside a machine they thought would never be opened. The sun was setting by the time he stopped staring at the Titan and went inside. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at Margaret's picture for a long time. She smiled back at him, frozen at 23, forever young and full of belief that the world made sense. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow, he'd cut it open completely. Tonight, he'd let himself imagine what might be inside. Probably nothing. Probably just an engineering quirk, some structural support he didn't understand. But the way his hands were shaking said otherwise. The way his pulse kicked every time he thought about that sealed compartment said his body knew something his mind didn't want to admit. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the cheap stuff all he could afford, and sat on the porch as stars emerged. The Titan stood in the yard like a sentinel, silent, waiting, keeping its secret for one more night. In the barn, James laid out tools under a work light that hummed and flickered. Angle grinder, hammer, chisel, cold dawn light seeped through gaps in the barn walls. He hadn't slept, couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that false wall and wondered what it protected. The grinder screamed to life. Sparks flew in orange arcs as the blade bit into the seam between original metal and the hidden panel. The smell was acrid, burning the sound like something dying. James worked steadily, cutting a vertical line, then horizontal, creating a rectangle he could pry loose. Sweat ran down his face despite the morning cold. His hands ached from gripping the grinder, but he didn't stop. 30 minutes in the blade broke through, a gap, appeared thin as a knife edge. James killed the grinder and grabbed a pry bar, wedged it into the gap, put his weight behind it. The metal panel popped free with a sound like a gunshot. It clattered to the barn floor, ringing in the sudden silence. James grabbed his LED flashlight and aimed it into the cavity. Gold. The word formed in his mind, but didn't feel real. 8 rectangular shapes, stacked neatly wrapped in what looked like oil-soaked canvas that had turned brown with age. Each one about the size of a loaf of bread. He reached in with trembling hands and pulled the first bundle out. Heavy, impossibly heavy. He laid it on the workbench and cut the strings holding the canvas together. The fabric fell away. A bar of gold. Dull yellow, not shiny surface, covered in dust, but unmistakable. On one face, stamped into the metal, a crown and star emblem. Serial numbers and words that made his breath catch. U.S. War DEPT. 1919, 400 Troy Oz. James backed away from the bench like the gold might bite him. His mind raced through calculations. 400 Troy ounces. Current gold price around $2,400 per ounce. That was, he couldn't do the math. Too many zeros. One bar alone was worth nearly $1 million. There were 7 more. He pulled them all out with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. 8 bars. 8. Arranged on his workbench like something from a dream or a nightmare, he couldn't decide which. Among the gold wrapped in a separate bundle was a thick sheaf of papers. Official documents typed on yellowed paper with letterheads he recognized even through the decay Department of War. European Reconstruction Program. James spread them out carefully. Manifests, shipping records, names and signatures, Captain Edwin Hughes, Major R.T. Kellerman, dates from March 1919, and at the bottom of the stack a hand-drawn map on waxed paper. A red pencil line traced a route from Rotterdam to New York to Chicago to Des Moines to his hands, froze Warren County. Final notation in careful script, hold until recalled. V.A. Victor Ashford. The man who'd owned this machine, the man who'd died penniless in 1941 according to the auction paperwork. He'd hidden this, built a secret chamber inside his own invention, and sealed away a fortune he never claimed. James sat on an overturned bucket and stared at the gold until his vision blurred. This wasn't his. Couldn't be. This was stolen. Had to be. You didn't hide legitimate gold inside farm equipment. You didn't mark it with government seals and lock it away from the world unless something had gone very, very wrong. But, God, the weight of it. 8 bars, maybe $7 or $8 million. Enough to save the farm 50 times over. Enough to... He cut the thought off, stood up, forced himself to breathe. A sound outside. Just wind, maybe. But James moved to the barn door and looked out. Nothing but his truck and the empty driveway. The morning sun painted everything gold ironic, he thought dimly. But his eyes caught something in the dirt near the barn entrance. A footprint, fresh, mud from yesterday's rain still damp in the treads. Size 11 boot, Vibram sole. James wore size 9. He'd been alone all morning. Someone had been here, close enough to the barn to leave a print, close enough to see inside if they'd wanted. The realization hit him like cold water. He wasn't the only one who knew about the Titan, wasn't the only one who'd been paying attention at that auction. James grabbed the gold bars and papers, wrapped them back in their canvas coverings, and carried them in 3 trips to the old grain bin in the corner. He lifted the false floor panel he'd built years ago to hide tools from potential thieves. The irony wasn't lost on him, and lowered the bundles into the space beneath, covered them with the panel, dragged a tarp over the whole thing. His hands were still shaking when he finished. The Warren County Public Library smelled like old paper and floor polish. James hadn't been inside since Margaret died. She'd been the reader brought home books by the armful, read to him in the evenings about places they'd never visit. Now he sat at a microfilm machine in the basement research room, scrolling through decades-old newspapers while fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Midwest Industrial Review, 1919 through 1922. He moved through the months scanning headlines about soldiers coming home, factories converting to peacetime production optimism, and exhaustion in equal measure. Then he found it. May 1920, page 6, Ashford Ironworks under federal investigation. The article was brief. Victor Ashford, prominent industrialist and war contractor, was being questioned regarding discrepancies in government shipment records. Missing gold valued at $2.4 million, $1919, James noted, which would be worth vastly more now. Ashford denied wrongdoing, blamed clerical errors during the chaos of international transfers. James kept scrolling. August 1920, front page this time. Warehouse fire ends Ashford. Inquiry. A massive blaze had destroyed Ashford's main warehouse and all records contained therein. The federal investigation was closed due to insufficient evidence. No charges filed. The article's tone was careful neutral, but James could read between the lines. Someone had made sure those records burned. He found one more entry. March 1941. Victor Ashford dies penniless at 51. Once wealthy industrialist found dead in boarding house. No known heirs. Estate consisted of rusted machinery auctioned to cover boarding debts. The obituary noted his former prominence with the kind of pity reserved for fallen men. James sat back the microfilm reader, casting flickering light across his face. The story assembled itself in his mind. Victor Ashford had taken the gold stolen. It diverted it, whatever the right word was, hidden it inside his own invention, probably planned to retrieve it later. But then the investigation came. The warehouse burned, and he'd spent 20 years living in poverty, afraid to touch the fortune hidden in plain sight until he died alone with his secret. Margaret's voice. Some prisons don't have bars. James thanked the librarian and walked outside into afternoon sunshine that felt too bright. He drove home slowly, mind turning over the implications. The gold was stolen, federal property. If he reported it, they'd take everything. Maybe give him a finder's fee, maybe not. The farm would still be lost. But keeping it meant becoming exactly what Victor Ashford had been, a man trapped by his own deception. His phone buzzed. George White, the sheriff, James's friend since high school, back when they'd played football together and thought life would stay simple. He answered. George's voice came through tired and skeptical. You called yesterday about someone lurking around your property, just asking you to keep an eye out. Something feels off. James, you've been alone too long. Isolation does things to a man's mind. Get yourself a dog. Come into town more. You're out there brooding yourself into paranoia. I know what I saw, George. Sure you do. Look, I'll have a deputy swing by when he's in the area, but I'm telling you, there's nothing going on. Nobody cares about old farm equipment." James hung up without saying goodbye. Nobody cares. Right, except someone had left a boot print outside his barn. Someone had been watching. He pulled into his driveway as the sun touched the horizon. The Titan stood where he'd left it, massive and silent. James parked and sat in his truck for a long moment, staring at the machine that had changed everything. $1. He'd bought a secret for $1, and now the secret was eating him alive. Inside the house, he made dinner, canned soup, saltines, coffee, and sat at the kitchen table. Margaret's picture watched him with that unchanging smile. James wondered what she'd think, whether she'd tell him to do the right thing and turn it in, whether she'd understand why he couldn't. The farm was dying, had been dying before he found the gold, but now there was a way out, a wrong way maybe, an illegal way certainly, but a way. He was still sitting there, soup gone cold, when headlights swept across his front window. A vehicle slowing on the county road. James stood and moved to the window, careful to stay in shadow. A truck, dark color, sitting idle about 100 yards from his gate. Headlights on, engine running. For 3 minutes it didn't move, just sat there, pointed at his house like a question. Then the engine cut off. Silence. James grabbed his Remington 870 from the hall closet. Hadn't fired it in 5 years since he'd gone deer hunting the autumn before Margaret died. He checked the chamber loaded and moved to the front door. Waited. 5 minutes passed. Nothing. No sound, except his own breathing and the creak of old wood settling. He opened the door slowly and stepped onto the porch. Shotgun held low. The truck was still there. Dark shape against darker road. No interior light. No movement. "Who's there?" "Come forward or leave." His voice sounded thin in the night air. No answer. Wind rustled through cornstalks in the field. An owl called from somewhere distant. The truck sat motionless. James walked halfway down his driveway, close enough to maybe see a license plate, and that's when the engine started. Headlights blazed on, blinding him. The truck reversed, quickly turned, and drove away. No plates visible, mud-covered, probably deliberately. He stood there until the sound faded completely, then walked back inside on legs that felt unsteady, locked every door, checked every window, sat in the kitchen with the shotgun across his lap and all the lights off, watching the darkness outside for movement. At 2 in the morning, a metallic clang echoed from the barn. James was on his feet, instantly, heart pounding. He grabbed the Remington, and a flashlight moved through his house to the back door, eased it open. The barn was 60 feet away, door slightly ajar, moving in the wind. Could have been wind. Probably was. He crossed the distance in a run, flashlight beam jerking across the ground, reached the barn and yanked the door fully open. The Titan stood in shadow, untouched. His workbench looked exactly as he'd left it. He swept the flashlight across every corner. Nothing. Then he saw the grain bin. The tarp was pulled back, not all the way, just enough. James moved closer, dread pooling in his stomach. He yanked the tarp off completely and lifted the false floor panel. The canvas bundles were still there, all of them. He counted, to be sure, 8. But on top of the canvas, something new, a scrap of denim fabric, blue. Not his, he wore brown Carhartt, and beneath the fabric, caught on a rough edge of wood, a single thread that glinted in his flashlight beam. Synthetic. Recent. Someone had been here. inside his barn, had found the gold or gotten close enough to see where he'd hidden it, and they'd left a message. We know. James backed out of the barn, shotgun raised, spinning, to check shadows. Nothing moved, but the feeling of being watched pressed down on him like physical weight. He secured the barn door from outside with a chain and padlock, then practically ran back to the house. Inside, he shoved a chair under the front door handle and did the same with the back. Drew every curtain, sat in his darkened living room with the shotgun, and waited for dawn. Sleep didn't come. Every creak was a footstep. Every gust of wind was a door opening. His mind ran through scenarios. Call the police. But George wouldn't believe him, and involving authorities meant explaining the gold. Run. But where? And run to what? By the time pale light bled through the curtains, James had made a decision. He couldn't do this alone, couldn't protect the gold and himself and the farm all at once. Someone out there knew, someone who'd been close enough to leave evidence, someone who'd come back. He needed help, real help, the kind that understood what 8 bars of stolen government gold meant, and what people would do to get them. James stood and walked to Margaret's picture, touched the glass. I'm sorry. I know you'd tell me to let it go. Walk away. Do the right thing, but I can't lose the farm, can't lose the only thing we built together. So I'm going to break every promise I made you about being honest and careful and good. I'm going to become the kind of man you wouldn't recognize. Outside, the sun rose over fields that still needed saving. The Titan stood in the yard, morning light, turning its rust to copper. Somewhere out there, someone was planning their next move, and James had to figure out his before they made it for him. The gold was his now. Not legally, not morally, but practically. Possession was 9/10 of the law his father used to say. The other 10th was survival, and James Walker intended to survive. The Honda Accord appeared 2 mornings later, silver and clean, against the dust of James's driveway. He watched from behind the kitchen curtain, shotgun leaning against the wall within reach. A woman stepped out, late 30s, professional clothes that didn't belong on a farm leather bag, slung over one shoulder. She moved with purpose, scanning the property like she was cataloging evidence. James met her on the porch before she could knock. Her smile was practiced but not fake. Patricia Johnson, Chicago Tribune. I write about historical cold cases. I heard through sources you purchased Victor Ashford's old Titan tractor at auction last week. James kept his hand on the door frame, blocking entry. Who told you that auctions are public record, Mr. Walker? I've been researching the Ashford case for 2 years. That tractor has significance beyond its mechanical value. What kind of significance? Patricia shifted her bag, and James caught the edge of exhaustion in her eyes, the kind that came from chasing something too long without catching it, the kind that explains why 3 different people contacted me about that exact machine in the last month, people who shouldn't even know it exists, people who've been looking for something Victor Ashford hid before he died. James felt the words land in his chest like stones. He'd been right. The watchers weren't random, weren't paranoia. They'd been circling that tractor for years, waiting for it to surface. And now it sat in his yard, broadcasting like a beacon. I bought it for decoration, that's all. Patricia's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted. Recognition, maybe, or confirmation. Mr. Walker, if that's true, you have nothing to worry about. But if you found something inside that machine, and I think you did, based on the fact you're holding a door closed instead of inviting me in, then you need to understand what you're dealing with. Victor Ashford didn't die of natural causes, the cocaine in his system. He never used drugs. Someone poisoned him, and the people who did it are still looking for what he took. The sun climbed higher, turning the yard into sharp shadows and bright patches. A crow called from the barn roof. James calculated risk against risk. Staying silent meant staying alone. Talking meant trusting a stranger. Both options felt like stepping off a cliff. He opened the door wider. 5 minutes. Tell me what you know. They sat at the kitchen table where Margaret's picture watched them both. Patricia pulled out a tablet and opened files, newspaper clippings, police reports, genealogy records. She moved through the material with the efficiency of someone who'd presented this evidence many times before. Victor Ashford was a government contractor during World War I. His company built steam engines for the European Reconstruction Program machinery to rebuild infrastructure destroyed by the war. In early 1919, he was hired to transport gold bullion from Rotterdam to New York. $50 million worth. About 5% went missing during transport. $2.5 million in 1919 money. James kept his face neutral, but Patricia was watching him with the intensity of someone trained to read lies. FBI investigated for 18 months. Never filed charges because the evidence burned in a warehouse fire that was almost certainly arson. Victor Ashford spent the next 20 years living in poverty while his former business partners thrived. He died alone in a boarding house. Official cause was lung disease, but the autopsy showed anomalies. Traces of a cardiac glycoside poison that mimics heart attack symptoms and cocaine he shouldn't have had access to. Why poison him 20 years later if the case was closed? Because someone found out he kept a piece of the missing gold. Insurance policy, leverage, revenge doesn't matter. What matters is that gold never surfaced, which means he hid it somewhere so secure even he couldn't risk touching it. Inside, something no one would open, something that would survive decades, something like a steam tractor built by his own company. Patricia leaned back, eyes locked on his. Now James saw it clearly. She wasn't guessing. She knew. Or at least suspected strongly enough to drive out here on what could have been nothing. His throat went dry. The coffee in his mug had gone cold hours ago, but he picked it up anyway, buying time. Every instinct screamed to deny everything. Kick her out, bury this deeper. But the boot print in the mud, the truck watching his house, the fabric in his barn, staying silent hadn't kept him safe. Maybe truth, selective truth, would buy him something better than isolation. If I had found something, hypothetically, what would you suggest I do with it? Patricia's expression didn't change, but her hand stilled on the tablet. Get it authenticated by someone trustworthy. Document everything. Then contact federal authorities through a lawyer who specializes in found property law. There's precedent for finders keeping a percentage, 30 to 40% typically. But you'd need proof of legitimacy and cooperation. Otherwise, it's just theft. And the people watching my house, the ones who've been circling for years. She closed the tablet with a soft click. The Caruso Group, private asset recovery firm, that's the polite term, criminal syndicate specializing in stolen antiquities and missing treasures is more accurate. They've been hunting Ashford's gold since the 1950s. If they know you have it, they won't stop. And they won't involve police, because that would mean losing their claim, which makes them more dangerous than any federal investigation. James stood and walked to the barn without saying anything else. Patricia followed silent, now letting him control the revelation. Inside, he pulled the tarp off the grain bin and lifted the false floor. The canvas bundles sat where he'd left them. He unwrapped one bar and set it on the workbench under the work light. The gold gleamed dully, crown and star emblem catching the light. Patricia moved closer, pulling reading glasses from her bag. She examined the stampings without touching the metal, and James saw her hands were shaking slightly. My God, this is real. This is actually real. 8 of them, plus documents, shipping manifests, maps, all dated March 1919. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. This isn't just stolen gold, Mr. Walker. These are government records from a post-war fund meant for European recovery. If someone diverted them, that's embezzlement on a national scale. And if Goodwin hid them, there's no telling who still wants this buried. People built fortunes on that missing money. Families, companies. They won't let this surface without a fight. James wrapped the bar back in canvas. His hands were steadier than hers. So what do? We verify authenticity first. I know someone at University of Iowa, metallurgist, who's authenticated historical artifacts for the Smithsonian. Get scientific proof, then we have leverage, protection. Right now, you just have very expensive metal and a dangerous story. The word "we" hung in the air between them, partnership or trap. James couldn't tell which, but the boot print said someone was already inside his circle. Maybe better to choose his allies than wait for enemies to choose themselves. You said people contacted you about the tractor. Who? Patricia pulled out. Her phone scrolled through notes. Anonymous call 3 weeks ago. Male voice asked if I'd heard about the Ashford estate auction. Hung up when I asked for a name. Email 2 weeks ago from a Proton Mail account, untraceable, saying the Titan tractor held answers about Victor Ashford's missing fortune. And last week, a man approached me at a coffee shop in Chicago. Wouldn't give his name. Said his family had been searching for closure about Victor Ashford for generations. When I mentioned I'd be coming to Iowa, he asked me to call him if anything turned up. Left a number that goes straight to voicemail. She showed him the number. James didn't recognize it. What did he look like? 40-ish. White. Fit. Wore a wedding ring. Drove a silver Ford F-150. James felt ice slide down his spine. The same truck that had been watching his property. The same type that had left tracks near his mailbox. His name. Did he ever say his name? Patricia shook her head, but her expression said she was making connections too. Wait, you've seen him. He's been circling my property since the day after I bought the tractor. I found his boot print outside this barn the same night I discovered the gold. Then he knows, or strongly suspects, which means we're running out of time. If he's working with Caruso, they'll escalate. If he's independent, he might try to cut a deal. Either way, you need that authentication. Today, the University of Iowa campus spread across Iowa City like a small civilization. Patricia drove her car her lead, while James sat in the passenger seat with one of the gold bars wrapped in a gym bag full of towels. The drive took 90 minutes through country that bloomed with late April green. They didn't talk much. James watched the rearview mirror compulsively, but traffic stayed normal, anonymous, safe. The material science building looked like every other academic structure, brick and glass, and the kind of architecture that said function over form. Patricia led him through corridors that smelled like chemicals and floor wax to a lab on the third floor. The sign read, Dr. Susan Davis, Metallurgical Analysis. Inside, a woman in her mid-50s stood over a spectrometer adjusting settings. She looked up when they entered, and her face brightened with recognition. Patricia, been a while. Too long. I need a favor. A big one. Dr. Davis glanced at James, then at the gym bag, then back to Patricia with raised eyebrows. This is the kind of favor that comes with complications, isn't it? The kind that might make your career if you're interested in historical metallurgy and government cover-ups. That got her attention. She gestured to a stainless steel examination table. Show me. James unwrapped the bar. Under the laboratory lights, the gold looked less mystical, more utilitarian, a brick of wealth stamped with bureaucratic precision. Dr. Davis approached it with the caution of someone who'd learned not to trust first impressions. She lifted it, grunted slightly at the weight, and carried it to a scale. 0.98 kilograms. Call it 400 troy ounces. That's substantial. The markings, can you verify them? Dr. Davis pulled out a jeweler's loupe and examined the stampings. Crown and star emblem is consistent with early 20th century U.S. Mint identifiers. The serial number format matches Treasury records from that period. But I need to run tests. XRF for composition mass, spectrometry for isotopic signatures, ultrasonic to check for core filling. She moved to her equipment, all business now. James and Patricia stood back watching machines hum to life. The first test took 10 minutes. A handheld XRF scanner passed over the bar, beeping, and data scrolled across a monitor. 99.7% gold, 0.2 platinum group metals, 0.1 trace elements. This is refined gold, not natural ore. Someone purified this to near absolute purity. The mass spectrometry took longer. Dr. Davis scraped a tiny sample from one edge. James winced and loaded it into a machine that looked like it cost more than his truck. Graphs appeared on screens, numbers James didn't understand. Dr. Davis leaned close, reading them, and her expression shifted from clinical interest to something approaching awe. The isotopic signature places this gold at the Witwatersrand Basin in South Africa. Mined between 1890 and 1910 based on the specific ratios. That's exactly where U.S. Treasury was sourcing gold for wartime reserves during World War I. Patricia exhaled slowly. So it's authentic, government gold from the Reconstruction Program. Not just authentic, legitimate Treasury property marked for international aid. Mr. Walker, do you understand what you have under the Archaeological Resources Protection Act and the National Stolen Property Act? You're required to report this within 30 days of discovery. James felt the weight of that deadline settle into his bones. What if reporting it gets me killed? Dr. Davis removed her safety glasses and met his eyes. Then you need FBI protection immediately. This isn't county sheriff territory. This is federal property theft from a century ago with current criminal implications. The people who want this aren't interested in legal proceedings. A phone buzzed. Patricia's. She pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and her face went white. "What?" "Unknown number." She answered on speaker. The voice that came through was male, deep with an accent James couldn't place. European, maybe, or practiced neutrality. "Miss Johnson, we need to talk about Mr. Walker's recent acquisition." Patricia's hand tightened on the phone. "Who is this someone who understands the value of cooperation? Mr. Walker found something that doesn't belong to him. We're prepared to negotiate a fair recovery fee. $10,000 for the safe return of 8 specific items." The silence in the lab felt vacuum-sealed. James's pulse hammered in his ears. "How do you know about 8? The voice carried a smile James couldn't see but felt. "We've been watching a long time, Mr. Walker. Longer than you've been alive. Victor Ashford was careless. You don't have to be. Accept the offer. Walk away clean. Everyone wins." Patricia spoke before James could. "And if he refuses, then everyone loses. But him most of all. You have 48 hours to consider. Instructions will follow." The line went dead. Dr. Davis stared at the phone like it might explode. "You need to call the FBI. Right now." Patricia was already scrolling through contacts. "I have a contact at the Chicago field office. Agent Sandra Thompson. She worked a Nazi gold case with me in 2019. She'll understand the implications." James walked to the window staring down at the campus quad where students moved between classes like nothing was wrong, like the world still made sense and threats came from midterms instead of voices on phones. "They're watching us. Right now." Patricia joined him at the window. "Which means we can't go back to your farm. Not yet. We make the call, get federal protection. Then we deal with this properly." But James wasn't listening. His eyes had locked on something in the parking lot below. A silver Ford F-150 parked 3 rows from Patricia's Honda. Diesel engine visible through the grill, mud-covered plates, and, leaning against the driver's side doors, a man in sunglasses, reading what looked like a newspaper, but was probably nothing of the sort. Too late for proper. They're already here. The 3 of them took the service stairs at the back of the building. Dr. Davis secured the gold bar in her laboratory vault, 6-inch steel biometric lock, and promised to contact federal authorities herself within the hour. Patricia had her phone pressed to her ear, waiting for Agent Thompson to pick up. James led them through a maintenance corridor he'd noticed on the way in, following exit signs that glowed green in the dim light. They reached Patricia's Honda without incident. Too easy, James thought. But he climbed into the passenger seat while Patricia started the engine, and they pulled out of the parking lot, heading west toward the interstate. The F-150 followed 3 cars back. James watched it in the side mirror. Keeping distance. Professional surveillance. The driver's face was lost behind glare on the windshield, but the truck stayed locked on them as Patricia merged onto Interstate 80. "Don't panic. Just drive normal." Patricia's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "I'm a journalist, not a spy. Normal doesn't include car chases. It's not a chase yet. He's just following. Wants to see where we're going. What do we do?" James thought about the shotgun locked in his truck back at the farm. Thought about Margaret telling him to always have a plan, even when the plan was just survive until tomorrow. Get off at the next exit. Not this one, coming up the next one. Grinnell. Then we lose him in town. Patricia nodded, accelerating slightly. 70 miles per hour. The F-150 matched speed. James counted vehicles between them. Two now. One a semi hauling grain, one a minivan full of kids. His chest tightened. Whoever was driving that truck didn't care about witnesses, didn't care about highway patrol. That level of confidence meant resources, backup, the kind of operation that didn't leave loose ends. The Grinnell exit appeared in half a mile. Patricia moved to the right lane. The F-150 did two closing distance now, one car between them. James could see the driver clearly, male, white 40s baseball cap pulled low. He's not letting us go. I see that. The exit ramp was 200 yards away. Patricia accelerated hard, Silverado's engine roaring. The F-150 responded instantly, closing to within 20 feet. James braced against the dashboard. When I say turn, you cut across every lane and take that exit at the last second. Don't signal. Don't slow down. Just go. 100 yards. The F-150 pulled into the lane beside them. James could see the driver's face now, jaw set, eyes hidden behind wraparound sunglasses. The truck drifted closer, inches from Patricia's door. Now Patricia wrenched the wheel right. Tires screamed. The Honda lurched across two lanes, cutting off a Volvo that laid on its horn. The exit ramp flew at them, and Patricia barely made the turn, rear end fishtailing as they decelerated down the curve. The F-150 missed the exit. James saw it blow past, watched the driver's head snap around, watched the truck brake hard in the left lane. Horns blared. A semi-truck, the same grain hauler from earlier, blocked the Ford from cutting across traffic. Patricia didn't slow down. She accelerated through the stop sign at the bottom of the ramp, turned left onto a county road, then immediate right into a residential street. Houses flashed past. She took another turn, then another, weaving through the grid of small-town America until they reached a cornfield access road. She pulled behind a machine shed and killed the engine. They sat in sudden silence, breathing hard. James's hands were shaking, Patricia's too. Through the rear window he could see the main road a quarter-mile away. Empty. No silver truck. No pursuit. 5 minutes passed. 10. Nothing. I think we lost him. Patricia's voice came out thin. For now. But he knows who I am. Knows I live in Chicago. Knows I'm connected to this story. James felt the guilt settle into his gut like lead. He'd pulled her into this, let her drive him to Iowa City, made her a target. I'm sorry. This wasn't supposed to. She cut him off with a sharp laugh that held no humor. This is exactly what it was supposed to be. I've been chasing this story for 2 years. Now the story is chasing back. That's how you know you're close. Close to what? The truth about what happened to Victor Ashford and why powerful people wanted him dead. Close to exposing a century-old cover-up. Close to a Pulitzer, if I'm being honest. So don't apologize. Just help me figure out who that was. James pulled out his phone and opened the photo app. He'd snapped a picture of the F-150 back at the parking lot. Instinct, paranoia, whatever you wanted to call it. He zoomed in on the driver's side window. The image was grainy but visible. Baseball cap, square jaw, and on the neck, just above the collar line, a tattoo. Dark lines forming a shape he couldn't quite make out. Patricia leaned over to look. "Can you enlarge that?" James pinched the screen. The tattoo resolved into something recognizable. A snake coiled around a compass rose. Black ink professional work. I've seen that before. Where? Not where. Who? I interviewed a former Caruso Group operative 3 years ago for a piece on stolen art trafficking. He had the same tattoo. Said it was their mark, members only, like a gang sign but for international criminals in suits. So the voice on the phone wasn't bluffing. They've been watching. They sent someone. Patricia's phone buzzed. Text from a number she didn't recognize. James read over her shoulder. "Nice driving, Miss Johnson, but there's nowhere you can go that we can't find you. Offer still stands. 48 hours. James felt the walls closing in. Highway, campus, now Grinnell. They were being tracked, followed, herded toward some endpoint he couldn't see yet, but felt approaching like weather. "We need to go to my farm, get the gold, move it somewhere secure. Your farm is the first place they'll look. Then we go to Michael Anderson." Patricia frowned. "Who? The man who's been watching my property, the one with the silver F-150. I think I know who he is." The drive back to Warren County took 2 hours circuitous routes, avoiding highways. Patricia kept checking mirrors while James explained his theory. Michael Anderson, neighbor 3 miles west, bought his property 5 years ago. Kept to himself mostly, but always seemed interested in James's land. Asked questions about the soil, the barn, whether James planned to sell. Then the Titan showed up, and suddenly Anderson was visiting twice a week. Friendly, too friendly. You think he's Victor Ashford's descendant. Family would explain the obsession, the long game, waiting for that tractor to surface at auction so he could track whoever bought it. Patricia pulled off onto a gravel road leading toward Anderson's property. "Then we confront him, see what he knows." The Anderson farm looked prosperous. New barn, fresh paint equipment that cost real money. A silver F-15, sat in the driveway. Different one, James noted, but same model. Michael Anderson himself stood in the barn doorway, grease-stained hands holding a wrench, and his expression, when he saw them pull up, was complex. Surprise, resignation, something close to relief. James wasn't expecting company. James climbed out of the Honda Patricia behind him. "We need to talk, Michael, about Victor Ashford, about why you've been watching my property, about the silver F-150 that tried to run us off Interstate 80 an hour ago." Anderson set the wrench down carefully. His posture shifted, still casual, but with tension underneath. A man preparing for confrontation. "That wasn't me on the highway. I've been here all afternoon. Ask my wife." Patricia stepped forward. "But you know why someone would try, don't you? You know what James found, because you've been looking for it your whole life." Anderson's jaw worked. He glanced at the barn, then back to them, making calculations. "Come inside. If we're doing this, we're not doing it in the driveway." The barn smelled like motor oil and cut hay. Anderson led them past a John Deere combine to a workbench covered in tools. He leaned against it, arms crossed, and the defensive posture crumbled into something raw. "My great-great-grandfather was Victor Ashford. I'm the last direct male descendant. When he died, my family got nothing. Worse than nothing, we got shame. 3 generations grew up hearing whispers about the Ashford thief, the man who stole from the government, who died disgraced. You've been searching for the gold to clear his name, to prove he wasn't just a thief, that there was more to the story. My grandfather told me before he died, told me Victor hid something in one of his machines, said if I could find it, maybe I could understand what really happened. So, when I heard about the estate auction, I went, saw that Titan, knew it had to be the one. But you bid first." James felt the weight of that moment differently now. The dollar bid, the laughter, 2 men circling the same secret from opposite directions. "So you followed me, broke into my barn." Anderson's face reddened. "I didn't break in." The door was unlocked, and I didn't take anything, just looked. Saw you'd found something based on the cut marks on the firebox. Then I backed off because I didn't know what I was dealing with. But someone else didn't back off. Someone with a snake tattoo. Someone who's been hunting this gold since your great-great-grandfather hid it. Anderson straightened. Snake tattoo. Jesus! That's Caruso. They approached me in 2018. Wanted to know about Victor, about the family, about any properties we still owned. I told them nothing. Thought I'd gotten rid of them. Patricia pulled up the photo James had taken. This looked familiar. Anderson studied it and shook his head. Different guy. Caruso runs a network. They've got people everywhere. If they know James has the gold, his voice trailed off, implications settling. Then they'll escalate. They'll stop watching and start taking. A phone rang. Not James's, not Patricia's, Anderson's. He pulled it from his pocket, glanced at the screen, and his face went gray. Unknown number. He answered on speaker, the same voice from before, European accent, smooth as oil. Mr. Anderson, good of you to bring everyone together. Saves us time. Now, you can all hear the revised offer. Anderson's hand tightened on the phone. What revised offer? We have something you want. You have something we want. A trade seems equitable. In the background of the call, James heard something, muffled, like fabric rustling. Then a woman's voice distorted by distance or fear. Patricia. Patricia went rigid. Who is that? That Miss Johnson is your sister Jennifer. She's quite safe at the moment. Whether she stays that way depends entirely on your cooperation. 8 gold bars for 1 life. 48 hours. We'll be in touch with location. The line went dead. Patricia stood frozen, phone still pressed to her ear, like the connection might restore. James watched the color drain from her face, watched her chest heave with breaths that couldn't get enough air. Anderson swore quietly, continuous stream of profanity that meant nothing and expressed everything. James grabbed Patricia's shoulders. When did you last talk to your sister? Her voice came out mechanical. 3 days ago. She lives in Madison, works in marketing. I told her about the Ashford case, told her I was coming to Iowa. She asked me to be careful. Did you mention me? The farm. I don't. I might have. God, I can't remember. I thought it was just research, just a story. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and dialed. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. She tried again. Same result. 3rd time a man's voice answered, not Jennifer's husband, someone else. Stop calling. She's with us now. Wait for instructions. Click. Patricia made a sound halfway between sob and scream. James caught her as her knees buckled, held her up while the reality landed. The Caruso group didn't make empty threats. If they had Jennifer, they'd use her. Leverage was their business model. Anderson paced the barn, running hands through his hair. We give them the gold. That's it. That's the only play. Patricia shook her head violently. They'll kill us all anyway. Standard protocol. Can't leave witnesses who know what they look like. Then what we call the FBI, they'll take 48 hours just to open a case file. James's mind raced through options, all of them bad, all of them ending in someone dead. But one plan glimmered in the chaos, risky, probably stupid, but the only path he could see. We give them fake gold, lid bars with gold plating. I saw Michael's electroplating set up. We make counterfeits good enough to pass initial inspection. Plant a GPS tracker inside one. Follow them to Jennifer, then call in the FBI. Anderson stopped pacing. The plating would take 12 hours minimum, and they'd need to test it. Any XRF scanner would see through it in seconds. Not if we coat it thick enough. 0.1 millimeter, enough to trick handheld scanners that only penetrate surface layer. Patricia wiped her eyes, forcing focus. Even if it works? Even if we follow them, what makes you think they'll let Jennifer go? They won't. Not voluntarily. That's why we need federal backup ready to move, the second we have a location. Patricia, you said you have a contact. Agent Sandra Thompson. Call her. Explain everything. Get tactical teams staged. Patricia nodded, already dialing. Anderson headed for his workshop. I'll start casting lead cores. We'll need 8 bars, exact dimensions. James, you get the measurements. We've got maybe 14 hours before they make contact again. The next 12 hours blurred into chemical smells and exhaustion. Anderson's workshop had everything: casting molds, electroplating tanks, industrial power supply. They worked in shifts. James took measurements from the real gold bars Patricia had photographed them at the university, and Anderson poured molten lead into custom molds. The metal cooled slowly, maddeningly. Each bar took 90 minutes, start to finish. While the lead set, James drove back to his farm under cover of darkness. The property sat quiet, no vehicles watching, but he moved fast anyway. Retrieved the real gold from the grain bin, rewrapped it in canvas, buried it in a new location under the floor of his chicken coop, last place anyone would look. Took photos of the documents for evidence, then drove back to Anderson's with the weight of federal crime pressing on his conscience. Patricia spent the time on phone calls. Agent Thompson in Chicago was skeptical until Patricia sent photos of the gold, the documents, the threatening texts. Then skepticism became interest, then alarm. Thompson said she'd coordinate with the Des Moines field office, have agents ready to deploy, but she needed 48 hours minimum to assemble a team. We don't have 48 hours. Then you're operating outside federal protection. If this goes wrong, you're on your own. The electroplating took longest. Anderson submerged each lead bar in a gold cyanide solution, ran current through it, watched atoms migrate from anode to cathode, and coat the base metal in a skin of precious element. 0.1 millimeter, barely thicker than paper, but under work lights, the bars gleamed convincingly. James tested one with a scale. Weight was close lead, being denser than gold, compensated for the thin coating. He scratched the surface gently with a knife. Gold flaked away, revealing gray underneath, but the scratch was subtle, would pass casual inspection. Anderson embedded a GPS tracker inside one bar, drilled a small hole, inserted the device, sealed it with gold-colored epoxy. The tracker was cell-enabled, reporting location every 60 seconds. If they find this, we're dead. Then we better hope they don't look that close. At 4 a.m. they finished. 8 counterfeit bars arranged on the workbench. They looked right, felt right, smelled like metal and chemicals and desperation. James wrapped them in canvas, matching the originals, and loaded them into a duffel bag. Patricia sat in the corner, laptop open, tracking her sister's phone. Still offline. Still nothing. The call came at 7 a.m. Same voice. Same European smoothness. Mr. Walker, I trust you've considered our offer. We want proof Jennifer's alive. Reasonable. Hold on. Rustling. Then Jennifer's voice strained but coherent. Patricia, don't give them anything. They're going to... The voice cut her off. As you can hear, she's unharmed. For now, the exchange will occur tonight. 11 p.m., Old Miller Grain Elevator, Highway 63 north of Des Moines. Bring the gold. Come alone. Any sign of police, she dies. Understood. James looked at Patricia and Anderson. Both nodded. Understood. Good. Don't be late. We're not patient people. The grain elevator rose against the night sky like a concrete tombstone. James approached it in his Silverado headlights, cutting through darkness gravel, crunching under tires. 11:15 p.m. He was late deliberately. Let them wait. Let them wonder. Small psychological games that probably meant nothing, but felt like control. The duffel bag sat on the passenger seat, heavy with counterfeit fortune. In his jacket pocket, a burner phone with Agent Thompson's direct line programmed. One button press for backup. But backup was 30 minutes away, minimum. 30 minutes was a lifetime when people started shooting. A black Dodge Sprinter van sat in the shadow of the grain elevator. No lights. Engine off. James pulled up 50 feet away and killed his engine. Waited. Let them make the first move. 3 men emerged. The first was older 50s expensive suit that looked wrong in a gravel lot. Slicked back hair catching moonlight. This was Richard Miller, the voice from the phone, leader of this particular operation. The other 2 were muscle, younger tactical gear, both with the snake tattoo visible on their necks. They moved like military. Former special forces, maybe? The kind who went private because government work didn't pay enough or asked too many questions. James climbed out, duffel in hand. Mr. Walker, punctuality isn't your strong suit. Where's Jennifer? Richard gestured. One of the bodyguards opened the van's rear doors. Jennifer Williams sat inside, zip-tied to a cargo ring, duct tape over her mouth. Alive. Terrified. But alive. Show me the gold. James unzipped the duffel part way. Let moonlight catch the bars inside. Richard moved closer, bent to examine, picked up one bar, hefted it, smiled. Heavy, very heavy. Good. The second bodyguard produced a handheld XRF scanner. James's pulse kicked. This was the test. Pass, and they'd proceed to the next phase. Fail, and bullets. The scanner passed over the bar's surface. Beeped. The bodyguard frowned, reading 99.7% gold. Richard's smile widened. Excellent. Load them. The bodyguard reached for the duffel. James pulled it back. Jennifer first. Richard's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. The gold first. Then we'll discuss. Headlights erupted from 4 directions. FBI megaphone voice shattered the night. Federal agents, drop your weapons, hands in the air. Richard swore in what might have been Italian, spun toward the van. The bodyguards drew pistols, compact, Glock suppressors attached, aimed toward the lights, toward James. Time fragmented. James dropped the duffel and dove behind his truck. Gunfire popped suppressed rounds that sounded like hammers on wood. His truck's windshield exploded. Lights went out. More gunfire, heavier now, unsuppressed. FBI returning fire. James crawled toward the van, staying low. Jennifer was still inside, trapped. The second bodyguard lay on the ground, blood pooling. Shot in the shoulder, writhing. The first bodyguard had fled toward the cornfield. K-9 unit barking somewhere. Chaos. Richard Miller was running for the van's driver's seat. James tackled him before he reached it. They went down hard gravel tearing skin. Richard twisted stronger than he looked, landed an elbow to James's ribs that knocked air out. But James had spent 40 years hauling feed and wrestling machinery. He hooked Richard's leg rolled, got an arm around his throat. FBI agents swarmed. Someone pulled James off. Someone cuffed Richard, who was shouting about lawyers and diplomatic immunity and jurisdictional violations. Someone cut Jennifer free. She collapsed into Patricia's arms. Patricia, who'd been hiding 500 yards away with Anderson, watching through binoculars, waiting for the signal. Agent Sandra Thompson approached James, where he sat in the gravel, catching his breath. She was younger than he'd imagined, early 40s, eyes that said she'd seen too much already. Mr. Walker. That was monumentally stupid. It worked. This time. You're lucky we got here when we did. Lucky that tracker worked. Lucky they didn't scan deep enough to find it. She held out the duffel bag. James looked inside. The fake bars gleamed up at him, still perfect, still convincing. You're going to need to come to Des Moines field office tomorrow. 9 a.m. Bring any documentation you have. Bring the real gold. We'll sort out the legal situation. Am I under arrest? Not yet, but withholding federal property for 2 weeks without reporting it, that's problematic. We'll see what the U.S. Attorney decides. Paramedics were loading the wounded bodyguard into an ambulance. The second one had been caught by the K-9 unit Belgian Malinois named Rex, who'd run him down in 30 seconds. Richard Miller sat in the back of an FBI van, face pressed against the window, staring at James with hatred that could melt steel. Jennifer and Patricia stood together, sister holding sister. Patricia caught James's eye across the chaos and mouthed, "Thank you." He nodded. Didn't feel like thanks were necessary. Felt like he'd pulled them all into hell, and somehow they'd clawed out the other side. Survival wasn't virtue, just luck. Anderson walked over, face pale. They're going to investigate me too. Family connection to Victor. Probably. But you didn't commit any crimes. You're a victim of your ancestors' choices. Doesn't always matter what you are. Sometimes matters what people think you are. Agent Thompson called out, Mr. Walker, Mr. Anderson, you're both coming with us. Protective custody until we're sure Caruso Group doesn't have more operatives. The caravan of federal vehicles pulled away from the grain elevator. 3 SUVs, 1 van, James's shot-up Silverado towed behind. Dawn was 3 hours away. James stared out the window at farmland rolling past in darkness and thought about Margaret, about the promise he'd made, about whether keeping the farm was worth becoming the kind of man who hid gold and lied to federal agents and put innocent people in danger. The answer should have been no. The fact that he wasn't sure anymore scared him more than anything else that had happened. The FBI field office in Des Moines occupied a building that looked designed to intimidate, concrete and glass, minimal windows, the kind of architecture that said, we see everything and you see nothing. James sat in a conference room on the 3rd floor, staring at a 2-way mirror that probably had cameras behind it. His hands rested on a table scarred with years of other people's confessions. 9 a.m., like Agent Thompson had ordered. He'd brought the real gold bars in a locked case that now sat between him and 3 federal agents who looked like they'd been awake for days. Sandra Thompson sat directly across from him. To her left, Agent Timothy Clark from Financial Crimes, thin-balled, the kind of intensity that came from counting other people's money for a living. To her right, U.S. Attorney Donald Thomas, who'd introduced himself with the warmth of a tax audit and hadn't smiled since. Thomas opened a folder thick with documents. "Mr. Walker, let's establish timeline. You purchased the Titan tractor April 20th. You discovered the hidden compartment April 23rd. You contacted Miss Johnson April 25th. You came to us May 3rd. That's 13 days of withholding federal property. I was being threatened. Followed. I didn't know who to trust." Thomas didn't blink. "You knew enough to authenticate the gold at University of Iowa, knew enough to create counterfeits, knew enough to negotiate with international criminals. That suggests sophisticated understanding of what you possessed." James felt anger rising, but choked it down. Margaret's voice in his head, "Don't let them make you small. I'm a farmer. I found something I didn't understand. I tried to verify it before making claims that could ruin my life. That's not sophistication. That's survival." Agent Clark leaned forward. "The gold bars are authenticated. We've confirmed they match Treasury Department records from the 1919 European Reconstruction Program. Serial numbers verify they were part of Manifest A147, which went missing during transport. What we need to understand is how much more you found. Documents, maps, anything that explains how Victor Ashford acquired them." James opened his phone and brought up the photos he'd taken. Shipping manifests, letters with War Department letterheads, the map with its red route and VA notation. He slid the phone across the table. "Everything I found is documented there. The originals are still at my farm, hidden. I can retrieve them if you guarantee my protection." Thompson studied the photos, zooming in on text. "Captain Edwin Hughes, Major R.T. Kellerman." These names appear in declassified files about the missing gold. Hughes died in 1920. Official ruling was suicide. Patricia Johnson thinks it was murder, cover-up to prevent him from exposing the truth. Thomas closed his folder with a snap. "Miss Johnson is a journalist with an agenda. We deal in evidence, not speculation. Right now, the evidence says you're in possession of stolen federal property. Under U.S.C. Title 18, Section 641, that carries up to 10 years. The number landed like a fist. 10 years. James saw the farm foreclosing while he sat in prison, saw Margaret's dream bulldozed for a parking lot, saw everything he'd fought for erased because he'd picked the wrong moment to be curious. Michael Anderson stepped in before James could respond. Anderson had been sitting quietly in the corner, technically under investigation himself, but cooperating fully. Now he stood hands flat on the table. "My great-great-grandfather died believing he was a criminal. Your government pursued him until the day he died, then let him rot in poverty while the real thieves lived comfortably. If there's any justice in this room, you'll look deeper before you start throwing charges." Thomas's expression didn't change, but something flickered in Thompson's eyes. She glanced at Clark, some unspoken communication passing between them. "Mr. Anderson has a point. The 1920 investigation was closed suspiciously fast, and if Victor Ashford was framed, that changes the legal picture. We need to examine the tractor again, more thoroughly, see if there's anything else hidden." The convoy back to James's farm consisted of 4 vehicles, 2 FBI SUVs, a forensics van, and James riding in the back of Thompson's car like a suspect instead of a cooperating witness. The sun was high by the time they arrived, turning the property into sharp shadows and exposed corners. The Titan stood in the yard exactly where James had left it, rust and steel and secrets. The forensics team worked for 6 hours. Ground-penetrating radar, ultrasonic imaging, metal detectors sensitive enough to find a dime under 6 inches of concrete. They mapped every hollow space, every weld, every rivet that looked out of place. James watched from the porch, drinking coffee that had gone cold, while his farm became a crime scene. Agent Clark approached at 3 p.m., tablet in hand. "We found something. Second compartment beneath the firebox. Smaller, sealed differently. Your angle grinder work didn't reach it." James followed him to the Titan. The forensics team had removed 6 steel plates from the machine's undercarriage, exposing a cavity the size of a shoebox. Inside, wrapped in waxed canvas that had survived a century, lay a leather-bound book. Thompson lifted it carefully with gloved hands. The leather was cracked, but intact brass clasp, still functional. She opened it to the first page. Handwriting in fountain pen, faded but legible. Property of Victor Ashford. Private journal. 1919 to 1940. The conference room became a reading room. Thompson, Clark, Thomas, James Anderson, and Patricia, who'd arrived with legal representation and press credentials, gathered around the journal laid open on the table. An FBI document analyst had verified the handwriting matched Victor Ashford's known signatures. The ink dated to the correct period. This was genuine. Thompson read aloud, starting with March 1919. "Captain Hughes approached me at the Union Club today. War Department wants my steamship company to transport gold from Rotterdam. $200,000 contract. Hughes hinted at opportunities during chaos. Said no one would notice missing crates. 50-50 split." The room went silent. Patricia was taking notes, fingers flying across her laptop. Anderson sat rigid, face pale. Thompson continued through entries. May 1919, the diversion of 8 bars to Chicago. Victor's decision to hide them in the Titan because he didn't trust Hughes. July 1920, Hughes found dead, officially suicide. The federal investigation closing in. September 1920, the warehouse fire, Victor's desperate attempt to erase evidence. Then came the entry from March 1940, and Thompson's voice changed, slower, careful, like she was reading words that rewrote history. "A letter arrived today that changed everything. From Colonel Francois Duchamp, French military liaison officer, 1919 European Reconstruction Program. Retired now, living in Lyon." She paused, pulled out a separate paper that had been folded into the journal. A letter on French military stationery, dated March 1940, written in English in elegant script. "Dear Mr. Ashford, I am writing to ease the conscience of an old man who may have wronged you. In 1919, I was liaison between French government and U.S. War Department for the gold shipment program. Recently, while organizing personal papers, I discovered classified memoranda never entered into official records. The 8 gold bars you and Captain Hughes diverted were already designated as discretionary compensation for industrial partners who exceeded contract performance. Your company delivered steam engines to Rotterdam 6 months ahead of schedule, preventing famine that would have killed thousands. The gold was legitimate compensation. Yours by right, But when accounting errors occurred during post-war chaos, the War Department panicked. Rather than admit incompetence, they launched criminal investigation. You and Hughes became scapegoats. Hughes discovered the truth and threatened exposure. That is why he was killed, not suicide. I tried to speak up, but was junior officer. No one listened. I am 71 now. I wanted you to know the truth before I die. The gold was earned, not stolen. You were innocent. With deepest regrets, Colonel F. Duchamp. The silence that followed was absolute. James felt something crack open in his chest, not for himself, but for Victor Ashford, who had died 20 years believing he was a thief when he'd been a victim. Anderson's voice came out hoarse. My great-great-grandfather was murdered by his own government and died thinking he deserved it. Patricia wiped her eyes, still typing. This is Watergate-level conspiracy. A century old, but still explosive. If this goes public, when this goes public. Thomas's voice had lost its prosecutorial edge. This changes federal liability. Changes everything. If Victor Ashford was owed that compensation, and it was never paid if he was wrongly investigated and his reputation destroyed, the government has exposure beyond the gold's value. Thompson closed the journal carefully. We need authentication from French National Archives, verification that Colonel Duchamp existed and served in that capacity, confirmation the memoranda he mentioned are real. Until then, this is compelling evidence, but not conclusive. James spoke for the first time in an hour. What happens to me? Thompson met his eyes. That depends on what the U.S. Attorney decides. But, Mr. Walker, you may have done something remarkable here. Not just finding gold, finding truth. The authentication process took 4 weeks. French National Archives confirmed Colonel Duchamp's service record. Found the memoranda he'd referenced buried in files declassified only in 2015, too late for anyone to care except historians. The War Department had indeed designated the 8 bars as discretionary compensation, had indeed bungled the accounting, had indeed covered it up by investigating Victor Ashford instead of admitting failure. Patricia's story broke in the Chicago Tribune on June 15th. Front page above the fold with photos of the gold bars and excerpts from Victor's journal. Within 12 hours, every major news outlet had picked it up. By evening, James's phone had 47 voicemails from reporters. By the next morning, 3 news vans were parked at the end of his driveway. Agent Thompson arranged a press conference at the FBI field office. James stood at a podium flanked by federal agents facing cameras that turned the room into a lightning storm of flashes. He read a prepared statement about finding the gold, cooperating with authorities, and respecting the legal process. Didn't mention the threats, didn't mention the counterfeits, didn't mention how close he'd come to keeping it all and running. Afterward, Thompson walked him to her office. The U.S. Attorney has decided not to file charges. You withheld evidence, yes, but under duress and for less than 2 weeks. Given the circumstances and your ultimate cooperation, prosecution isn't warranted. However, the question of ownership goes to federal court. You'll need legal representation. I can't afford. She held up a hand. Several attorneys have offered pro bono representation. This case is career-making. You won't lack for options. What about the gold? The farm court will decide compensation. Could be 30% of value, could be 50, could be nothing if the judge rules you had no right to it. But, Mr. Walker, You're not going to prison. That's something. It was. James drove home through countryside that looked exactly as it had 6 weeks ago, but felt completely different. The Titan stood in his yard now, covered with a tarp per FBI orders potential evidence if the case went to trial. His mailbox overflowed with letters. Some were threatening. Most were supportive. One was from a woman in Seattle who claimed to be another Ashford descendant and wanted to talk about family history. He sat on his porch as the sun set and thought about how easy it would have been to say nothing. Bury the gold deeper, sell it piece by piece on the black market, take the money, and disappear. Margaret would never have known. No one would have known except him and the weight he'd carry forever. Sometimes the things we hide end up hiding us. The thought came unbidden in her voice. And he realized it wasn't just Victor Ashford's story. It was his own. He'd been hiding since she died, hiding from people, from life, from the future. The gold had forced him into the light, forced him to decide who he was going to be when no one was watching. The hearing was scheduled for August 10th at the federal courthouse in Des Moines. James arrived in a suit he'd worn to Margaret's funeral and hadn't touched since. It still smelled faintly of her perfume lavender and something else, something that was just her. He took that as a sign she approved, or at least understood. The courtroom was smaller than he'd imagined. Wood paneling, American flag, seal of the federal judiciary hanging behind the bench. Judge Elizabeth Jones presided, appointed by Obama in 2014, according to the briefing his attorney had given him. Late 50s, sharp eyes, reputation for fairness, tempered with impatience for bullshit. James sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, Robert Williams, who'd taken the case pro bono because, quote, "This is the kind of law school professors dream about," unquote. Across the aisle, U.S. Attorney Thomas represented the Treasury Department with 2 assistants and enough paperwork to rebuild the Library of Congress. Michael Anderson sat in the gallery with 22 members of the Ashford family who'd materialized from across the country once Patricia's story broke. Patricia herself was in the front row, notepad-ready recorder, running. Dr. Susan Davis was present as expert witness. Agent Thompson sat in back observing. Judge Jones called the room to order at 9 a.m. sharp. We're here to determine ownership and compensation regarding 8 gold bars discovered by Mr. James Walker inside a 1918 Titan steam tractor previously owned by Victor Ashford. Mr. Thomas, your position. Thomas stood, buttoned his jacket. Your Honor, the gold bars are federal property designated for the European Reconstruction Program in 1919. While the circumstances of their concealment are now better understood, the fundamental fact remains: they belong to the United States Treasury. Mr. Walker is entitled to finder's fee under established precedent, but the property itself must be returned. Judge Jones turned to Williams. Mr. Williams, your client's position. Your Honor, my client found abandoned property after 80 years of government failure to locate it. Under treasure trove doctrine and the precedent of Eads versus Brazelton, he has legitimate claim to significant compensation. Moreover, the gold was earned compensation wrongly withheld from Victor Ashford. The government created this situation through incompetence and cover-up. They should not profit from their own misconduct. The arguments went on for 3 hours. Thomas cited statutory law, federal property regulations, historical precedent. Williams countered with common law, abandonment doctrine, government liability for wrongful persecution. They debated whether the gold was truly abandoned or merely lost, whether finders' rights applied to government property, whether Victor Ashford's descendants had any claim. Michael Anderson testified about 4 generations of poverty and shame, about children who grew up hearing their ancestor was a thief, about careers limited because the Ashford name carried stain. His voice broke when he described his grandfather's final words, "Find the truth so our family can hold their heads up." Patricia testified about her investigation, the inconsistencies in Hughes's suicide, the warehouse fire that destroyed evidence, the pattern of government officials involved in the 1919 program who became mysteriously wealthy in the 1920s. Dr. Davis presented her metallurgical analysis, confirmed the gold-matched Treasury records, explained why the bar's isotopic signature proved South African origin, made it clear this wasn't some random treasure, it was documented government property with a paper trail. At noon, Judge Jones called recess. James ate a sandwich he couldn't taste in a conference room, while Williams explained that it could go either way. Judges had wide discretion in found property cases. Precedent existed for both generous and stingy compensation. They reconvened at 2 p.m. Judge Jones had her decision prepared unusual speed that suggested she'd spent the lunch break writing. This case presents unusual circumstances. Mr. Walker discovered property that was simultaneously lost government assets and legitimate but unpaid compensation to Victor Ashford. The gold's history includes government incompetence, wrongful investigation, and probable murder to conceal bureaucratic failure. These factors complicate straightforward property law. She paused, looking directly at James. "Mr. Walker, you could have kept this gold, sold it quietly. No one would have known, but you cooperated with authorities despite personal risk. That cooperation led to revelation of historical injustice. In my view, that deserves recognition." James felt his chest tighten. However, the law is clear that government property does not transfer to private hands through mere discovery. The gold belongs to the United States Treasury, but Mr. Walker is entitled to substantial finder's compensation. She consulted her notes. The gold's current market value is $7.68 million. Under finder's fee doctrine and considering the extraordinary circumstances, I award Mr. Walker 35% of that value, $2.688 million, to be paid by the Treasury Department within 90 days. The courtroom erupted. James heard the number but couldn't process it. $2.6 million, enough to save the farm 50 times over, enough to Judge Jones wasn't finished. Regarding the Ashford family, while Mr. Anderson and his relatives have no legal claim to the gold itself, they have suffered reputational harm from government misconduct. Victor Ashford's name is hereby officially cleared. All allegations of theft are vacated posthumously. Furthermore, I order the Treasury Department to establish the Ashford Family Historical Justice Fund in the amount of $500,000 to be administered by Mr. Anderson for educational and memorial purposes honoring Victor Ashford's actual legacy. Anderson made a sound halfway between laugh and sob. People in the gallery were hugging, crying, shaking hands. Judge Jones raised her gavel. Finally, regarding the Titan tractor and Victor Ashford's journal, These items are designated National Historic Artifacts. The tractor is returned to Mr. Walker for public display purposes. The journal and related documents are donated to the National Archives, with copies provided to relevant parties. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down. The room exploded into motion. Reporters rushed for exits. Attorneys gathered papers. James sat frozen, staring at his hands, waiting for the moment to feel real. Williams clapped him on the shoulder. "Congratulations, Mr. Walker. You just became a wealthy man." But James was thinking about Victor Ashford, about a man who'd earned something and never got to enjoy it, about secrets that poisoned lives across generations, about how truth sometimes comes too late to heal the person who needed it most, but maybe heals everyone who comes after. Michael Anderson found him in the courthouse lobby, surrounded by Ashford descendants James had never met. They thanked him with words that tumbled over each other, voices thick with emotion. One woman pressed a photo into his hand. Young Victor, maybe 25, standing beside a steam engine with pride in his eyes. Before everything went wrong, before the government destroyed him, take this, remember him like this, remember he was good before the world made him hide. James pocketed the photo, shook hands until his arm ached, gave his phone number to people who wanted to stay in touch. The Ashford family felt like his family, now bound by shared ordeal and unlikely victory. Patricia caught him on the courthouse steps. Television cameras were setting up for remote feeds. She'd be doing interviews all evening. "You did it. You got justice for all of them. I found a tractor for $1. Everything else just happened." She smiled, the kind that said she knew better but would let him have the moment. "When I write the book, I'm calling it that. The dollar tractor has a ring to it." "You're writing a book. Already have a publisher interested. 6-figure advance. Want to split it? Your story deserves to be told. Tell it however you want. Just get the truth right. That's all that matters." James drove home alone through summer evening light that painted the cornfields gold. The radio played news about his case, experts debating precedent, historians analyzing the Ashford cover-up, talking heads arguing about government accountability. He turned it off, rolled down the windows, let Iowa wind fill the cab with the smell of growing things. The farm would survive. More than survive, thrive. He could pay off the bank repair equipment, hire help, maybe even expand. But none of that felt as significant as the weight lifting from his chest, the weight of being alone, the weight of hiding, the weight of believing the best parts of life were finished. 6 months blurred past like time-lapse photography. James's first act with the settlement money was paying First National Bank in full $87,000 that erased the foreclosure notice and gave him clear title to the land. The banker who'd sent the final notice looked uncomfortable accepting the check, but James just smiled. No hard feelings. Business was business. Survival was survival. He bought a John Deere 8R410 top-of-the-line tractor with GPS guidance and enough horsepower to pull stumps from next county over. The dealer offered to haul away the old broken machine, but James declined. That tractor had earned retirement, not a scrapyard. The barn got rebuilt. New red paint, white trim, Margaret's colors. The roof no longer leaked. The doors hung straight. Inside, proper lighting and organized tools and a workbench that didn't wobble. James hired 2 farmhands, Ryan Robinson and Scott Hill Cousins from Grinnell, looking for honest work. They moved into the old bunkhouse he'd renovated with actual insulation and plumbing that didn't freeze. The farmhouse took longer. New roof first, then windows that sealed properly. Siding repaired where rot had crept in. Inside, he repainted every room choosing colors Margaret had circled in magazines years ago. The kitchen got new appliances. The bathroom got a shower that had water pressure. Small things that added up to the difference between surviving and living. The corn yield that fall was 55% higher than the previous year. Combination of new equipment, better irrigation, and soil that had time to recover. James stood at the edge of his field in November, watching the combine work, and the satisfaction felt deeper than money. This was what Margaret had wanted, not wealth, just the farm working the way it was supposed to. The Titan Tractor Monument went up in early December. Professional contractors built a stone foundation in the front yard, reinforced concrete base strong enough to hold 4 tons of steel. They mounted the Titan on it with ceremony, using the same crane that had loaded it onto James's trailer back in April. Felt like closing a circle. The bronze plaque was Patricia's idea, though James wrote the words. Titan 1918, the machine that revealed truth. Discovered by James Walker, April 2024. Inside this tractor lay hidden the story of Victor Ashford, an innocent man wrongly accused, and 8 gold bars that waited 80 years to tell the truth. Sometimes what's buried isn't just treasure, sometimes it's justice. LED spotlights illuminated it at night. People started driving by to see it. Parents brought kids to take photos. Local paper ran a feature. Tourism board added it to county attraction maps. The Titan became famous in the way Midwestern things sometimes do, quietly without pretense, earning respect through substance instead of flash. Michael Anderson became a regular visitor. Weekly dinners alternating between farms, conversation ranging from crop rotation to family history to the strangeness of their shared experience. They'd started as neighbors, became conspirators, ended as something close to brothers. Both men who'd lost wives young, both men rebuilding lives around absence. Patricia's book contract came through in September. She'd visit every few weeks, recording interviews, photographing locations, gathering details. The working title was The Tractor's Secret, until her editor changed it to what Patricia had suggested on the courthouse steps, The Dollar Tractor, How One Farmer Uncovered America's Lost Gold. Publication scheduled for October the following year. Early advance reviews called it Pulitzer material. She donated 20% of her advance to James, $120,000. He tried to refuse until she threatened to mail him checks monthly until he cashed them. You made this story possible. You earned this. I bought a tractor. You did the actual work. We both know it's more complicated than that. HBO optioned the book for $2.1 million. Patricia called from Los Angeles, voice barely containing excitement. They wanted to start filming in Iowa next spring, wanted to use James's actual farm, wanted him to consult, maybe appear in a few scenes. I'm 61 years old, not exactly Hollywood material. That's exactly why they want you. Real beats fake every time. James thought about it for a week before agreeing. Not for the money they were offering, $150,000 location fee. That was nice, but not necessary. For Margaret, she'd always said the farm belonged in pictures. Maybe this was close enough. The changes weren't just physical. James joined the Unitarian Universalist Church in town, Margaret's denomination, though he'd never attended after she died, found comfort in Sunday services that focused on justice and reason instead of guilt and salvation. Started volunteering at the Veterans Hall, serving lunch to elderly vets who reminded him of his father. He went on 2 dates. First was Melissa Thompson, the county librarian recommended by George White's wife. They had coffee, talked about books and farming and the strangeness of sudden fame. She was kind and intelligent and everything that should have worked, but James felt nothing except politeness. Drove home knowing he wasn't ready, might never be ready, and that was okay. The second date happened by accident. He was buying feed at the co-op when a woman around his age dropped a 50-pound bag on her foot and swore loudly. James helped her to a bench, brought ice from the manager's office, ended up talking for an hour about the challenges of running a farm alone. Her name was Rachel Widow for 3 years, 160 acres, southeast of town. They exchanged numbers, met for coffee a week later, then dinner, then a farm tour where she gave him advice about drainage issues that was actually useful. It didn't become romance, but it became friendship. Another person who understood grief wasn't something you got over, just something you learned to carry differently. By March, James's net worth sat around $2.1 million after expenses. He set up the Margaret Walker Memorial Scholarship $50,000 annual endowment for rural Iowa students studying agriculture or environmental science. First recipient was a girl from Newton whose family farm was 3 generations old and struggling. The look on her face when she got the notification made James understand why wealthy people created foundations, not for tax breaks, for the feeling of being useful beyond your own survival. The museum idea came from Michael Anderson during one of their dinners. The Ashford family wanted to honor Victor's memory with something permanent. James wanted to make the Titan accessible to people beyond his front yard. They sketched plans on napkins. Simple building central exhibit space, educational focus. Local architect offered pro bono design work. State Historical Society kicked in a matching grant. Construction started in May. The Ashford Walker Agricultural Heritage Museum occupied 8 acres adjacent to James's property. He donated the land. Michael contributed $200,000 from the Ashford Family Historical Justice Fund. State of Iowa matched with $300,000. Total cost $1.2 million, split across donors and grants, and enthusiastic crowdfunding that raised $150,000 from people who'd followed the story. The building was timber frame construction barn style, massive windows facing west to catch sunset. Inside, the Titan took center stage, temporarily relocated from James's yard for 6-month exhibition. Then, a perfect replica would replace it so the original could return home. Glass cases held Victor's journal, the French colonel's letter, shipping, manifests photographs, interactive displays, explained European reconstruction, government corruption, the mechanics of steam tractors. A theater showed Patricia's documentary 15 minutes covering the whole story from auction to courtroom. The gift shop sold books, replica models, T-shirts with the Titan silhouette. All proceeds funded operations and scholarships. Michael managed it part-time, hiring 2 staff members from the Ashford family, eager to be part of the legacy. Grand opening was scheduled for April 20th, 1-year anniversary of James buying the Titan. Invitations went to everyone involved: FBI agents, attorneys, journalists, descendants, politicians. Governor of Iowa confirmed attendance. French ambassador requested invitation after hearing about Colonel Duchamp's role. CNN planned coverage. National Geographic sent a photographer. The day arrived with perfect Iowa spring weather, 70 degrees light, wind sky so blue it hurt to look at. 500 people filled the museum grounds by noon. Flags snapped on poles. Children ran between exhibits. The smell of grilled food from the catering tent mixed with fresh-cut grass. James stood near the entrance, shaking hands, answering questions, trying not to feel overwhelmed. He'd given maybe 4 public speeches in his life, all of them at agricultural meetings. Now he was supposed to address 500 people plus television cameras about truth and justice and historical vindication. Patricia found him backstage, adjusted his tie. Nervous, terrified. Good. Means you care. Just tell them what happened. Tell them what it meant. Everything else takes care of itself. The ceremony started at 2 p.m. Governor Reynolds spoke first, praising Iowa values and agricultural heritage and the importance of historical accountability. Enthusiastic applause. Then Michael Anderson, representing the Ashford family, voice shaking as he thanked everyone who'd helped clear Victor's name. More applause, some tears. Patricia spoke briefly about investigative journalism and the power of persistent curiosity. Standing ovation. Then James's turn. He walked to the podium looking out at faces he knew and didn't know. Found Ryan and Scott near the front, gave him thumbs up. Found George White, his skeptical sheriff friend, who'd apologized 6 times for not taking the threat seriously. Found Dr. Davis, Agent Thompson, U.S. Attorney Thomas, who'd become almost friendly once the case concluded. Thank you all for coming. I'm just a farmer, not used to microphones or crowds, but I learned something this past year that feels important enough to share. The audience settled into attentive silence. I bought a tractor for $1 because I was broke and desperate. Farm was failing. Wife had been gone 5 years. I thought maybe an old machine would remind me of better days. Didn't expect to find gold. Definitely didn't expect to find truth. Victor Ashford died believing he was a thief, lived 20 years in poverty and shame because powerful people cared more about protecting themselves than about justice. That's not unique, happens every day, in small ways and large. People get crushed by systems that won't admit mistakes. Truth gets buried because it's inconvenient, but truth is patient. It waited 80 years inside a machine nobody wanted inside, layers of steel and rust and silence. Waited for someone to care enough to look. He paused, gathering thoughts. This museum isn't just about gold or tractors. It's about remembering that truth matters, that innocent people matter, that sometimes doing right means risking everything. Victor Ashford never got to see his name cleared, but we remember him now. We tell his story. And maybe that's justice late, incomplete, but real. Margaret used to say, the best things are what others overlook. She was right. Sometimes the most valuable things are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to stop and notice. I'm grateful I noticed. Grateful for everyone who helped turn noticing into something meaningful. This place exists because Victor Ashford refused to quit even when quitting made sense. because his descendants refused to accept shame they didn't earn, because truth eventually wins, even when it takes a century. Thank you for being part of that victory. The applause was thunderous. James stepped back from the podium, legs shaky, and Michael caught him in a fierce hug. Patricia was crying, professional journalist reduced to tears by the weight of narrative finally reaching conclusion. The crowd moved inside for tours, exclamations echoing as they encountered the Titan in full exhibition, lighting gold replica bars gleaming under glass. Victor's handwriting preserved on pages that had nearly been lost forever. James found a quiet corner outside and just breathed. The sun was warm on his face. The air smelled like fresh earth and possibility. He'd woken up that morning in a bed Margaret had chosen in a house they'd built together on land that would outlive them both. And, for the first time since she died, that felt like enough. 18 months after finding the gold, James woke to October morning light filtering through curtains Margaret had sewn. Autumn 2025. The farm was running itself, Ryan and Scott handling daily operations, James providing oversight and enjoying semi-retirement at 61. The museum had hosted 12,000 visitors. Patricia's book had hit #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, stayed there 11 weeks. HBO filming was scheduled to start in March. James made coffee and carried it to the porch. The Titan monument stood in the yard, bronze plaque catching morning sun. He'd gotten used to seeing it there, used to the occasional car slowing down for photos, used to being recognized in town as that guy who found the gold. Mail arrived around 9. James walked to the box, flipped through the usual bills and advertisements. One envelope stood out, cream-colored paper, international postage postmark from Geneva, Switzerland. No return address. He carried it back to the kitchen and opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper, handwritten in elegant script. Dear Mr. Walker, my name is Pierre Duchamp. I am the great-grandson of Colonel François Duchamp, who served as liaison between French government and U.S. War Department in 1919. My great-grandfather's journal, which I discovered last year in our family estate, mentions Captain Edwin Hughes and Victor Ashford. He wrote that Hughes and Ashford believed they stole gold from America. They did not. The 8 bars were already marked for discretionary compensation to industrial partners who exceeded contract terms. Victor Ashford's company delivered steam engines 6 months early, saving thousands of lives in the reconstruction effort. The gold was meant as bonus. But when accounting errors occurred, the War Department panicked and launched investigation to cover incompetence. Hughes and Ashford were scapegoats. Your discovery has vindicated my great-grandfather's account. He always believed Ashford was innocent, but could not prove it. Now, through your courage, the truth is known. Enclosed is a small token from our family. The false bottom lifts out. You will find my great-grandfather's Legion of Honor medal from WI. He would want you to have it. With eternal gratitude, Pierre Duchamp, Lyon, France. James set the letter down with shaking hands, looked at the envelope again. Something shifted inside when he tilted it. He reached in and pulled out a small box wood with brass hinges. Opened it. A bronze medal lay on faded velvet. Red ribbon, engraved on the face, Honneur et Patrie, Honor and Country, dated 1918. On the reverse, in tiny script, Colonel F. Duchamp, service to the Republic. James lifted it carefully. The metal was cool, heavy with history and meaning. He thought about Colonel Duchamp dying in 1952, never knowing if his letter to Victor had made any difference. Thought about Victor dying in 1940, believing he was a thief when he'd earned every ounce of that gold. Thought about all the people who carried shame they didn't deserve because someone needed a scapegoat. He walked to Margaret's picture on the wall, her smile frozen in youth, forever 23, forever believing the world made sense. I wish you could see this, all of it. We made a difference. That dollar tractor changed everything. His voice came out rough but steady. He'd said variations of these words before, but today they felt final, like a door closing on grief and opening on something else. Not forgetting, never forgetting, but letting go of the weight. The phone rang. Patricia calling from Chicago. James HBO just greenlit the series. 6 episodes. They want to start production in March, like we discussed. And there's interest from international markets. This story is going global. That's good. Victor deserves global, and you deserve credit. You're going to be famous, James. Really famous. Are you ready for that? He looked out the window at the Titan Monument, at fields that had almost been lost, at the barn Margaret helped paint, at sky that stretched endless and blue. Ready or not doesn't matter. It's happening. Might as well lean into it. They talked about logistics and contracts and filming schedules. James half listened, making agreeable sounds, but his mind was elsewhere. On a letter from France. On a medal earned in one war and given to resolve another. On how sometimes justice takes 100 years, but arrives anyway. After Patricia hung up, he walked outside. The museum was visible in the distance, flags snapping in October wind. Michael Anderson's truck was parked there, museum, open hours, tourists arriving, history being preserved in real time. James drove over, medal in his pocket. Found Michael in the office reviewing attendance logs. Got something to show you. He laid the letter and medal on the desk. Michael read slowly, eyes widening. When he finished, his hand went to his mouth. Colonel Duchamp's grandson, the grandson of the man who tried to save Victor, and he sent you his great-grandfather's Legion of Honor. James nodded. Feels like the story is complete now. All the pieces finally together. Your great-great-grandfather was innocent. My dollar gamble paid off. Patricia got her book. The Caruso Group is in federal prison. Jennifer is safe. The farm is saved. And France just sent confirmation that truth matters across oceans and generations. Michael stood, moved to the window overlooking the main exhibition hall. The Titan replica stood surrounded by school children on a field trip, teacher explaining how steam power worked, how secrets can hide in plain sight, how ordinary people sometimes stumble into extraordinary circumstances. You know what the best part is? Kids are learning from this, learning that corruption doesn't always win, that patience pays off, that one person caring enough can change history. That's Victor's real legacy, not the gold, the lesson. James joined him at the window. Margaret would have liked that. She always said teaching was the most important work, helping people see past surfaces to what matters underneath. They stood in comfortable silence, watching children ask questions, touch interactive displays, pose for photos with the Titan. Outside, October sun painted everything gold ironic, given the story, but fitting somehow. This had always been about more than metal, about more than money, about dignity and vindication, and the stubborn human belief that wrongs could be righted if you just refused to give up. That evening, James returned to his porch with bourbon he could now afford, good stuff aged 12 years, smooth enough to drink slow. The sun was setting, throwing long shadows across the yard. The Titan monument glowed in the fading light, transforming from rust to copper to something almost living. He thought about the past 18 months, the terror of being watched, the weight of choosing between survival and honesty, the gunfire at the grain elevator, the courtroom where justice arrived late but arrived nonetheless, the museum opening, the medal from France, all of it connected by a single thread, $1 at an auction on a day when he'd been desperate enough to believe rust could be beautiful. Sometimes you buy something for $1 and get exactly what you paid for. Junk, weight without value, something to fill space and fool yourself into thinking you accomplished something. But sometimes, just sometimes, that dollar buys a story. And the story changes everything. The bourbon burned pleasantly. Stars emerged one by one, familiar constellations Margaret had taught him to find during their first summer together. Cassiopeia, Orion, the Big Dipper, leading to Polaris, the North Star that never moved, constants in a world that wouldn't stop shifting. His phone buzzed. Text from Ryan. North 40's ready for winter planting. Want me to go ahead or wait for your call? James typed back, Go ahead. You know what you're doing. And Ryan did. They all did. Life was moving forward, carrying him along, whether he was ready or not. The farm would outlive him. The museum would tell Victor's story long after everyone involved was gone. Patricia's book would sit on library shelves for decades. The HBO series would stream indefinitely. Truth once released was impossible to recapture. A car pulled into the driveway. Rachel's Subaru. She got out with a casserole dish and a smile. Figured you might be sitting out here brooding. Made chicken pot pie. Margaret's recipe, her sister gave it to me. James stood feeling something warm that wasn't bourbon spread through his chest. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to. Besides, I need your advice about irrigation. And Michael invited us to the museum next week for some French delegation visiting. Descendants of Colonel Duchamp, apparently. Should be interesting. They went inside, ate dinner at the table where Margaret's picture watched with approval, talked about farming and weather and the strangeness of life after survival. Rachel left around 9, promising to bring her own questions about soil pH levels tomorrow. James cleaned dishes and walked one more time to the Titan, placed his hand on the cold steel, felt the weight of history and accident and all the moments that had led here. Thank you for keeping secrets, for waiting, for being exactly what I needed when I needed it. You saved me when I couldn't save myself. The machine stood silent monument to patience and to the strange paths justice takes. Somewhere in France, Pierre Duchamp was probably asleep, unaware. His letter had arrived. Unaware, the medal had found a home with someone who understood its weight. Somewhere in Chicago, Patricia was writing the epilogue to her book, trying to find words that captured redemption, delayed but not denied. Somewhere in the soil of Iowa seeds were germinating that would become next year's harvest. And James Walker, 61 years old widower, farmer, accidental hero, stood in his yard under stars that had witnessed everything and revealed nothing, finally understanding what Margaret had tried to tell him before she died. The best things are what others overlook, not because they're hidden, because most people stop looking too soon. They see rust and quit. They see damage and walk away. They see complexity and choose the easy path. But some people, the ones who matter, the ones who change things, keep looking, keep digging, keep believing that underneath the surface, truth is waiting, waiting to be found, waiting to be told, waiting to remind everyone that what's buried isn't always lost. Sometimes it's just sleeping until the right person comes along and says, I see you. I believe you. Your story matters. James walked back to his house, locked the door, and climbed into a bed that no longer felt too empty. Tomorrow would bring more tourists, more questions, more responsibilities of being the man who found the gold. But tonight was his, Margaret's, Victor's, Colonel Duchamp's, all the people who'd carried pieces of this story across years and oceans and lives they'd never meet. The truth was out now. The gold was accounted for. The names were cleared. And somewhere in the space between what was lost and what was found, justice had taken root and grown into something that might outlast them all. That, James thought as sleep pulled him down, was worth more than 8 bars of gold, worth more than millions, worth everything.